This is the book I've been waiting for. It's called We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions. It's by Musa al Gharbi. And what it does is it takes a lot of other thinkers have taken strains, bit off pieces of this moment. Call it wokeness, call it social activism. John McWhorter is a good one. He talks about religion and words, and Yasha Monk was on the show. In his latest book, he goes back and talks about the intellectual underpinnings. Even some commentators who I've had on the show, a guy named Ernest Owens, who has a long book just defending cancel culture. Even that is useful as a text or a document. But I think a synthesis of everything we've been living through for the last, and Musa will explain, more than the last few years, it goes back a long time, everything we've been living through is analyzed, is described, new phrases, maybe too many new phrases, are introduced, and I'm pleased to have Professor Al Gharbi on the show. Hi, welcome to The Gist.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So first is woke, and let's not, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? Social activism, is that good? Do you want another kind of shorthand if someone objects to or finds offense in the word woke?
Social activism, wokeness, whatever. I'm pretty ecumenical, as I say in the intro.
Cool. It's one of those things that we all know what it means, even if we want to dispute it. And I think at this point, those disputing it have a little bit of the quality of people in your dorm room asking if my color red is the same your color red, which is, by the way, something you get into, right? Like, You can't define woke, but can we really define red or love?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's this kind of move in the discourse where it's like, if you can't provide some kind of discrete and unobjectionable analytic definition, then you don't even know what it means, and you're not really talking about anything. And it's like, that's not really how language works, as Ludwig Wittgenstein and a whole bunch of others have shown. Like a lot of the words that we use, just ordinary words. In my class on interpersonal communication, I try to have students define apple. In a way that includes 100% of apples, but would not include any other fruit or any other thing. And they struggle with it. It's hard, but that doesn't mean, like, if I tell them, hey, go grab an apple, they have no idea what to do, and they'll come back with a banana or a cucumber or something, right? Like,
right.
So we don't have to define words to understand them and be able to use them. And so for the purposes of my book, instead of getting into one of these definition wars, I just kind of paint a picture of some of the things that people seem to be talking about when they talk about wokeness, that people across the spectrum would probably agree. So as an example, it's just one quick example. There's the idea of trans-inclusive feminist. People across the spectrum would probably agree that someone who is not a feminist is certainly not woke. Someone who is not trans-inclusive is certainly not woke. So there are a whole bunch of these things like this that actually there is kind of broad agreement across the spectrum of what we're talking about here. There's some disputes, on the margins and things like that, but we don't really need to worry about that to talk meaningfully about it.
So there's another phrase that we have to get to, which is symbolic capitalists. It's a good phrase. It's a useful phrase. It's a phrase that tries to swim in waters that others have tried to define. A guy named Richard Florida, a sociologist, came out with The Creative Class. That was maybe one of those best-selling books that, as you detail in your book, was read by probably only a couple thousand people. But the idea of there is an elite, but it's a certain kind of elite. They're not the Koch brothers, right? They're not engaged in extractive industries. They're maybe in education or podcasting, or they run a newspaper. And their capitalism, meaning the people who hold the means of production, right? It's not just that they believe in capitalism. They might make noises saying that they don't. But their means of production are tied to symbols as opposed to crates on a dock. You want to get more into what you mean by that and why it's useful or necessary in understanding your thesis?
Yeah. So you I think you summarized symbolic capitalists well. At their core, there are people who work whose day jobs involve the production and manipulation of symbols and ideas and data and things like this. So they're people who are not providing physical goods and services to people.
Are lawyers, by definition, symbolic capitalists?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah,
so lawyers would be. But
lawyers,
doctors wouldn't.
Well, physicians would be. And in fact, there's this interesting schism in the medical profession that goes back actually centuries. But like today, for instance, if you look at doctors versus surgeons, doctors are physicians versus surgeons. Physicians are overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party. Surgeons are overwhelmingly aligned with the Republican Party. And
so the Republican Party, or some people would give you an economic reason for that. How far does that go, do you think?
Well, the thing about the doctors and surgeons is they both they work in the same institutions. They have similar education levels. They tend to live in the same communities. They earn comparable incomes. Surgeons maybe earn a little bit more, but like doctors also have healthy six-figure incomes. And so the main difference, and this is a difference that goes back again, as Andrew Abbott shows in the System of Professions, it's actually a divide that goes back centuries, because physicians are basically symbolic capitalists. They don't do things to people's bodies. They diagnose and prescribe. That's mostly what they do. All the people who do things to the body, draw blood, collect samples, do this, that, they have people for that. So they diagnose and prescribe. And from the beginning of the medical profession, doctors have always looked down on people like dentists and surgeons who actually do physical interventions on people's bodies. And the people who do physical interventions on people's bodies have long resented physicians, both for the fact that they don't do anything in the kind of traditional sense, and then also because they resent being looked down on in this way. And so the fact that doctors and surgeons currently find themselves on these opposite ends of this cultural divide that's very deep in the United States and Western societies, that actually shouldn't be surprising. That's actually a cultural divide within the medical profession that goes back for a long, long time now.
So interesting. So if you look at the academy, the more symbolically capitalist the academic discipline is, the more likely they are to be aligned with Democrats. And I believe this is true, every single department is more likely than less likely to be Democrat or liberal. But the engineers among the academics are least likely. Now we get to computer science. Isn't that by definition symbols? Are they symbolic capitalists? They're not definitely as liberal as, say, sociologists.
Yeah, much less than sociologists. But yeah, computer scientists are symbolic capitalists. Well, and this is what one of the things that's interesting about symbolic capitalists and engineers and other people like that is that they often work, again, as you said, they often work with and in industries and sometimes live in communities that are not kind of symbolic economy hubs. And often work for industries that aren't just tied to symbolic capitalism. So there's a lot of computer scientists who do work with ExxonMobil or basically any Applebee's, any company that you can think of that provides some kind of physical good or service to people.
The military, Palantir. There's good examples. Okay, so the reason that it's important to understand what symbolic capitalism and who they are, to bring us to what you're trying to argue in the book, is this wokeness, which is not a recent trend and it shows up in many ways, in many forms over the years. It's driven by this class.
Yes.
These are the people who embrace it, who benefit from it, and who foist it upon the rest of us. And given their position in society, they're able to do that in a way that even a very rich guy like one of the Koch brothers could not, simply by extracting minerals from the ground.
In fact, this is one of the key sources of contemporary political divides in America. I should say, I have a second book that I'm working on that kind of, so this book is kind of focused on symbolic capitalists and the cities we live in and the ways we justify inequality. I have a second book that's kind of turned the lens around from the people who are the winners in the symbolic economy to people who perceive themselves to be the losers. And one of the things that's interesting is when you look at a lot of people who are rich by like in a traditional economic sense, they're rich. So maybe they own a bunch of car dealerships or a chain of grocery stores, or they run a construction firm. And so some of them are millionaires, or they make really robust six-figure incomes and stuff like this. A lot of them feel like they're not as elite as they should be, because in the past, if you ran a chain of grocery stores and you were kind of the local baron who had all of this, you got a lot of respect and clout in your community. The kids looked up to you, they wanted to be you, and all of this kind of stuff. Today, if you're that person, the kids don't look up to you and want to be you. The kids all want to be TikTok stars and New York Times journalists and fancy academics and stuff like that. And so even though you have money, the money doesn't get you the kind of prestige and cultural clout and things like this that it used to, because a lot of this has been consolidated into a shrinking number of communities, a shrinking number of industries that you don't have access to just in virtue of being rich.
Yeah.
And this is a source of a lot of resentment. And so there's actually a lot of data that when you look at who's bankrolling the Republican Party today versus the Democratic Party is the party of multinational corporations and symbolic capitalists. The Republican Party is funded by what you could call family-owned businesses, so not incorporated businesses. They're often pretty large, so like, again, a chain of grocery stores or something like this, or a chain of car dealerships. Those folks and people who work in the extractive industries are the kind of primary base bankrollers of the Republican Party today in terms of finances.
Okay, so we've done a lot of laying of the predicate. The other huge thesis in your book, and the title of the book, which echoes a famous sociological tract, we have never been
modern.
We have never been modern. I was going to say we've never been civilized. We have never been modern. The idea being the idea of that track, we look at these other primitive cultures where we say, oh, that's not us, but they're exactly like us. We have never been woke. The idea of wokeness is a constant in society, and what it really does is tell us something about who the elites are and who's wielding this term. So, interestingly, you say the George Floyd protests, often the exact same people, but if not the exact literal same people because of age, the same exact kind of person as the Occupy Wall Street protests. And when I think about them, I think, well, they're different. Occupy Wall Street was economic based. It wasn't so explicitly racially based. They very much wanted to have this. They had this shtick about we're never going to tell you what our aims are. And also a big part of it, the George Floyd protest was during a time of the Me Too movement, whereas the Occupy Wall Street protest predated that, and there was a lot of horrible stories about sexual assaults actually in the Occupy Wall Street compound. So I've taken some of your ideas and told them back to you, but what else do we need to add to understand this idea that there is this permanent protesting class that we now call woke?
Yeah, I mean, so I think when you look at who took place, who participated in Occupy, it actually turns out it's roughly the same. So it's highly educated people. Occupy protests were overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, people who had college degrees or were in college. They occurred almost exclusively in knowledge economy hubs. When you looked at the employment of the people who had jobs and participated in Occupy Wall Street protests, almost all of them worked in the symbolic professions. Less than a quarter of them had jobs that were providing physical goods and services to people. And so it's the same. And actually, when you look at some of the political operations of, so even this thing about refusing to offer policies and the kind of progressive stack thing, the kind of weird bureaucratic rules they had about who could talk and under what circumstances. And this isn't stuff of like working class people who work normie jobs who want to like participate in these weird bureaucratic rules about who gets to
or
talk
even
and
if
when.
you go to a union hall, they're not doing the human microphone where one longshoreman says something and then everyone else repeats it. It's weird. It's quasi-religious. It has the quality of catechism. But go ahead.
Like one of the things that we are the 99% obscures is the fact that the very people participating in Occupy, these highly educated people and so on, are the primary beneficiaries of contemporary inequalities. They're actually the ones who benefit the most from the very inequalities that they're condemning. And as Richard Reeves pointed out, this narrative of we are the 99% is very convenient for upper middle class and wealthy people. It allows someone who makes incomes of $250,000, $150,000, and so on to go, oh, I'm just one of the little guys. I'm in this exact same boat as the person checking out my groceries. We're all just part of the 99%. I'm not profiting any more from the system than you are. It's Jeff Bezos. He's the problem. Elon Musk is the problem. And that's not really a class-based understanding of society in any meaningful sense. Then as you move forward through things like the March for Science and Me Too and Black Lives Matter and so on, there's this. It turns out it's actually the same. It's actually the same cohort of people. So if you look at all of these later resistance protests, like there's this narrative that it's all young people and kids these days and so on. But when you look at who's actually participating in them, who is actually driving them, it's actually early to mid-career professionals. It's the same people who were in the Occupy protests, but just 5 years later. And so it's actually the same cohort of people who have been. But the critical thing that the book emphasizes is this tendency, this kind of period of these tendencies to have these like decade-long periods of rapid change in how symbolic capitalists talk and think about social justice, these kinds of rapid shifts in our political attitudes and our political activities, so protesting and donating at much higher levels, becoming much more active and vocal about politics, more intolerant of dissent, and so on. There are actually these periodic episodes that break out like this pretty regularly. So the post-2010 period wasn't something that's new or novel or caused by smartphones or kids these days. It's actually a case of something. And there are similar episodes like this that go back a century.
I hear as a defense of wokeness, and usually by people who very much object to the term, what you're calling wokeness or deriding as wokeness, it's just, I'm so sorry for that, I can never stop that. It's just decency. It's just treating people decently. It's within the tradition of, back in the 70s, someone, you could call it woke to allow a gay person to adopt. I mean, that's probably through the 80s and 90s. 10 years ago, what you called woke was maybe just allowing a trans person to walk down the street without catcalls. So wokeness is just a label that pretty troglodytic members of our society apply to what they don't like. It's been, you want to say, Musa, that there's been a tradition? Sure, that's the tradition, that it's a derision of progress. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that's important to recognize about woke and political correctness and a lot of these terms like this is that they weren't actually created by conservatives and Republicans. They were used by people on the left, unironically. In the early 2010s, a lot of people were calling themselves woke, proudly and unapologetically. And then within the left, there came to be this divide between some people who came to understand wokeness as being kind of aware and committed to addressing social justice, and other people on the left who understood wokeness to be this kind of commitment to ridiculous symbolic gestures and a kind of sanctimony and lack of self-awareness. And then eventually this dispute within the left about what wokeness, about wokeness, came to be seized on by the right, and they used it as a cudgel to basically hit anyone that was left of center and deride them as woke. And this is the thing that played out with political correctness as well. So politically correct, a lot of people define themselves unapologetically as PC, proudly. And politically incorrect, they would say, like, you're politically incorrect, man. And they meant, like, problematic in today's parlance. But then you saw the same kind of thing. Within the left, a lot of people started associating political correctness with this kind of symbolic gestures and sanctimony and lack of self-awareness. It got seized on by the right. And then eventually no one started calling themselves PC anymore. And you had people like Bill Maher, who published, who had a show called Politically Incorrect, like to be politically incorrect even gained a positive valence.
And they got fired for being just that.
Yeah. And so you this kind of contestation over the term wokeness is not new, but it's also not just a right-wing thing. So the term was initially on the right, and on the left, and it was initially other people on the left who started criticizing wokeness. But then the second point, and actually the more important point to my mind, is that what I show in the book is that when you look at these periods of awakening, these periods where symbolic capitalists all of a sudden become much more concerned and engaged on social justice things, where the ways that we talk and think about the world shift radically and so on, they don't actually tend to change much. No. They don't change much. And so the examples you highlighted about the growing embrace of whites, of non-white people, kind of the decreases in prejudice and discrimination and hostile attitudes, or the growing embrace of LGBTQ people, the kind of increasingly progressive attitudes towards women, and kind of the this actually has very little, when you look at the trend lines, and whether you're talking about things like interracial marriages, so behaviors, or whether you're looking at polling, or whether you're looking at changes in law. There's basically no relationship at all between all of these positive developments and the awakenings. There's just basically a kind of straight line, where a kind of straight positive line, whether you're talking about laws, attitudes, or behaviors, of people just becoming, in America, becoming more tolerant of different kinds of difference. And so the awakenings go up and down and up and down and up and down, and then this line just goes straight, completely orthogonal. So that this whole melodrama that unfolded over the last 10 years and that unfolded in these previous episodes had absolutely nothing to do, and didn't in any way, shape, or form change this kind of broader path of kind of increasingly progressive views among
And we
Americans.
just get progressive because we get progressive? Norman Lear shows or anything prodding it along doesn't help? Or are you saying that those prods will always be there in the culture and we don't need to go out of our way to facilitate them?
Yeah, I'm saying the drivers, whatever is driving those positive trends, there are a number of theories about them, but they have nothing to do with the kind of the woke outputs in entertainment and news industries and the cancel culture campaigns and all of that has nothing to, and in fact, if anything, one thing that often, a regular consequence of the awakenings, because symbolic capitalists, we tend to kind of be politically weird and morally weird compared to most people. And during awakenings, the gap between us and everyone else grows bigger than it used to be. And it also becomes more salient, like people care about it more because we spend that time villainizing and demonizing and confronting and trying to suppress anyone who disagrees with us. So people care about these differences more than they used to.
Right, and when we raise the salience of an unpopular stance, it will always engender a backlash.
Yes, and this is actually one of the main consequences of awakenings. Not only is there not generally movement in the direction that we want, but there's often some movement in the direction that we don't want. And so one of the main...
Which serves to reify in the minds of the woke how right they are. Look at that.
Yes.
Look at how powerful, look at how best-selling Donald Trump Jr.'s book is against us.
Yeah, and it gives us this kind of false impression of normies and of how much better we are, how much more noble we are than normies, and this false impression, as you said, that we're kind of engaged in this really important struggle against really powerful people. But the truth is, like if aliens came down to Earth and just abducted everyone who voted for Donald Trump ever, a lot of the problems that we're concerned with would not change at all. The Republicans aren't the problem. I mean, a lot of the blue cities that Democrats control with one-party rule, that with complete... are the places where a lot of this stuff is the worst. So in New York or California, 1 out of every 12 residents of these states is a millionaire. Immense wealth in these states, but also the highest poverty rates in America, despite all of this wealth. The highest rates of racial segregation. They're some of the most diverse states in the country, but they're also some of the most segregated. New York has the most segregated school systems in the entire country. And it's not because of Republicans, and it's not because of MAGA people, because in New York City especially, and even true at the state level, but in New York City, Democrats control it with one-party rule. I mean, the primary for who gets to be the Democratic nominee is actually what the election is in New York City. On election day, when they have a Republican technically on the ballot, it doesn't matter. Whoever the Democratic nominee is going to be the candidate, and everyone knows it. And so there's no Republican opposition that helps explain why you see such poverty and misery and inequality and exploitation and segregation and all of this in these decisively blue cities and states. It's not because of MAGA. It's not because of Trump. It's not because of the Republicans. It's because of people like us. And this is even true of the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations too. If you want to understand how any of this stuff happens, you have to look at us. Anand Giridharadas is public intellectually, has this great book called Winners Take All, which is about how millionaires and billionaires leverage their money and through nonprofit donations and things like this, try to paint themselves as a solution to the very problems that they create.
And Anand gets hired to go to Aspen and tell the millionaires and billionaires this. He's very woke, by the way.
Yeah. And what's wild, though, real quick, what's wild about his argument, it's a good book, but like when you look at like who actually makes that alchemy happen, like who is it that runs the PR firms through which the rich people, oh, that's symbolic capitalists. Who is it that runs and administers the nonprofits through which they're, oh, that's symbolic capitalists. Who are the fawning journalists who give them these kinds of puff pieces and celebrating all of the, oh, that's symbolic capitalists. Who's helping them launder their money in the first place through finance and stocks? And oh, that's symbolic like everything that that people want to criticize about the millionaires and the billionaires and multinational corporations and the government. It's people like us who make it happen.
How much does the recent Great Awakening depend on words compared to previous Great Awakenings? Because that's my observation. It's very, very language based.
Yeah, I mean, so this focus on symbolic outputs, on the kinds of victories that you're seeking being mostly symbolic in nature, that unfortunately has also been a consistent. So in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of the debates in the gender wars were about referring to people as Ms. instead of Mrs. or Miss, or using kind of degendered language. So instead of talking about mankind, talking about humankind, and so on. So a lot of these, there were these same kind of struggles over language and controlling people's speech and having people say things in just the right way. Unfortunately, those have been part and parcel of pretty much all of them as well.
I used to love sociology, and I really try not to get into a silo where all I'm reading are ridiculous sociological tracks. But I find, I gotta say, the majority of sociology output to be eye-rolling these days, or at least not very convincing. But then I talk to people such as yourself who are sociologists, and they either say, well, the roots of our profession are different, or they say, you know, you're only being exposed to a small percentage. Overall, like every other discipline, sociology has its problems, but don't throw it away. Give me a state of sociology, because right now, I got to tell you, my son is going to college, and he's interested in a lot of things. And when I studied sociology, it was so interesting. I would steer him away from sociology. I just think you could get confirmed any supposition you had. There's not much rigor in the profession. Things get published that are either irrelevant or wrong. And after this happens for the 100th time, I have to conclude maybe there is something fundamentally broken about the profession. You're a sociologist. You're a trained sociologist. What do you think?
Yeah. So I think there are some problems in the field. One of them being that the field has this reputation for being really left-wing, not wrongly. And we don't really engage much with across the aisle. And as a result, a lot of people across the aisle don't bother to engage with us. So when you look at one of the reasons why economics, for instance, has a bigger impact than sociology in the contemporary sphere, most economists are also Democrats. But they're comfortable talking to Republicans. If you're a Republican, you can talk to an economist and say, well, what's the best approach? Here's what I want to do. What's the best way to do it? And economists will give you an answer, even if they're not Republicans themselves, and even if they don't fully agree. But if the perception is, if you're a Republican and you go to a sociologist and say, well, how should I do X? What should I do here? They would tell you, stop being a Republican. And so they wouldn't be able to give you that advice. And so they don't even seek it out. So there is this kind of perception problem that's not entirely ungrounded. It is the case. Christian Smith, a sociologist at Notre Dame, has a book called The Sacred Project of American Sociology, where he argues that the American tradition of sociology does have its roots from the beginning of being kind of the policy arm of the progressive social reform movement. So from the beginning of the sociology tradition in the United States, it has been kind of more political than sociology was in the European context.
Yeah.
But that said, a lot of the work that I do, when I started in the field, I was like, oh, crap. Like, am I going to fit in well here, and so on and so forth. And the thing is, there is a lot of work that's that's good and not at all that's like rigorous and good work. And there are a lot of people who are kind of normie people who are, well, I wouldn't say normie, but they're but they're not extreme woke people who are like who are out to do this kind of but they are less prevalent.
And they are censoring themselves.
And they're quite, a lot of them are censoring themselves. And so actually this is one of the things when I started at Columbia. For instance, I started noticing all this research on Trump and Trump voters that had these glaring errors and stuff. And I wanted to write a paper on this. And so I told one of my colleagues at Columbia, a professor there, I was like, yeah, I see all these errors about Trump and Trump voters. And he's like, oh yeah, I see a lot of them too. I have a whole file drawer of these kinds of terrible studies on prejudicial studies and so on. And I was like, oh great, we should write a paper about that. And he was like, I will never do that, and you shouldn't either. Unbeknownst to him, I had already had a paper under review on this topic, and it was published. It's called Race and the Race for the White House on Social Research in the Age of Trump. But a lot of people who notice these kinds of problems don't feel comfortable talking about them because in the field, what they're worried about is that if you criticize research on Trump and Trump voters, there are a lot of people in the field who will say, oh, well, why are you concerned about this at all? Are you a Trump voter? Like, why would you be interested in there being a fair and accurate understanding of like what's actually happening in the political sphere, unless you are actually some kind of a and it's not like that's not the modal response, but it doesn't necessarily need to be everyone or most people who have that kind of response for it to make your life miserable.
Right.
It just takes a few.
Just a vanguard of people who will dedicate themselves to your destruction, and either it will work or you'll regret it. And what you say is, oh, there are so many other things I could have done. And they would be good things, and they would be accurate things. So why? Every research is hard and takes rigor. I'm going to do one that gets my peers mad at me and maybe threatens my future advancement and has my mentor, the guy who's in charge of me, advising me against it. What's the upside? Yep.
Yeah. And so a lot of people end up, and so there are a lot of people who recognize some of these problems. There are a lot of people who actually have very reasonable opinions, who don't agree with a lot of this stuff, but they don't feel comfortable necessarily speaking out because it only takes a couple of people committed to destroying you to really mess up your thing, and you're not often sure who's and what. Like, you're never quite sure if you're in a room of colleagues, are they going to be the one who destroys me, or are they kind of cool, chill people? And you don't want to find out the hard way who's in which camp. And so there's a lot of this kind of suppression. But that said, to go with the classical sociological argument, in science as a profession, Max Weber, one of the kind of founders of sociology for less familiar listeners, Weber argued that it's always been true of science, though, that most science is wrong or trivial. Like, if it's true, it's trivially true. And most of what we do, like Weber argued, if scientists can even publish one thing over the course of their life that has a meaningful impact that people are actually reading after they're dead, or that or that it even marginally changes the field a little bit, if they can even do one thing like that in the course of their entire career, it's amazing. Like the modal academic paper in any field is cited only a couple of times at best, and it's usually self-citations, and almost no one reads it. Like, a handful of people read them. And so a lot of the kind of the nicheness, I have a section in the book called Tempest in a Teapot that's all about how limited the reach is for academic work and a lot of this other work that symbolic capitalists do.
Right.
And so it's absolutely...
And even the bestsellers like Thomas Piketty, that's the best-selling nonfiction book of an academic, but it's also the least read till the end book.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's definitely the case that a lot of the things that sociologists do are kind of niche and wrong and whatever, but that's also true in like almost every other academic field.
That's true,
just
but
in
so
the name
maybe
of
it's
fairness.
not paper citation that the effect is had, but the cumulative effect of teaching people facts and how to think. And if those are warped and have no limiting principle to correct their errors, which I think is just the worst error you can have, the worst mistake you could make is to endorse a system where you can't correct mistakes.
Yeah. Well, and this is a problem with the field.
Bad.
Well, yeah, and a big problem with a lot of social research fields and with the science enterprise more broadly, I guess, right now, is a lot of the systems and institutions that we have, things like peer review, decisions by committee, and so on, are premised on the idea that each of us are biased and limited. We have partial situated knowledge. We can't fully become purely objective just on our own by kind of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. And so the idea is by thinking with peers who have different interests and different values and different worldviews and different specialties, by having them kind of catch our blind spots and our biases and stuff like that, we can learn more together, have a more comprehensive, objective picture of the world. Okay, but these systems only work as intended when you actually do have substantive differences in terms of values and perspectives and experiences in a world where the people who are academics are this narrow, niche, idiosyncratic slice of society, and where almost all of us share the same moral and political views, then not only do those systems not really work so well, they actually can work in the opposite way that we intended. It can become difficult for people who hold dissenting views to make it through peer review or institutional review boards or hiring committees. It can be difficult. You can have misinformation cascades, a whole null fields that get created. So fields that get created where the whole field is kind of bullshit, but no one has the ability to actually say the emperor has no clothes.
Give me an example.
Huh?
Give me an example of one.
So in medicine, I'll give you an example for from the kind of biological sciences. There was this kind of cartel of researchers who had this idea of, who advanced this narrative about how cancer spread and how cancer was transmitted. And because all of the people, there was one guy in the field who came up with this idea, a lot of the people who were who controlled the major journals and stuff were friends of this guy or students of this guy. And so they basically had a cartel where they systematically suppressed anyone who disagreed with their understanding of how cancer worked. They had a hard time getting published in the major flagship journals of the field, and so on and so forth. And then it turns out this guy was just wrong. He was flat wrong. But it wasn't until he died that they were able to actually start publishing. And so there's this whole field of research, all these papers that got published in the meantime. Yeah. That agreed with this guy, because that was the only way to get published in some of these top journals, was to argue for the preferred narrative. And so you had this whole null field, this whole huge body of work that was created that was garbage. And in my own field, there's a null field right now. There's this whole literature about Trump and Trump voters that basically argues that the main reason why those people vote the way they do is that they're racist, sexist, misogynist, blah, blah, blah. Yes. The problem with this narrative...
Conservatives are more driven to authoritarianism by nature.
And the problem with this narrative, as I show in that paper I mentioned and a lot of other work, is you actually can't explain in a meaningful way why Trump won through these narratives. So it's been the case, actually. So Trump had kind of stagnant turnout with white voters compared to Mitt Romney. He actually won a smaller share of the white vote. The reason he was able to win in 2016 is because despite middling performance with whites, he outperformed his predecessors with blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. So it was non-white voters, shifts among non-white voters that allowed him to win.
That's right. He had a smaller percentage of the white vote in a country where the white vote was a smaller percentage of the electorate.
Yes, was shrinking. Yeah, he got a smaller piece of a shrinking pie. And then over the course of in every election since, Trump has been consistently, and the Republicans more broadly, have actually been consistently losing support with white people. And but these gains have been offset by continued growth with non-white voters, black people, Hispanic people. And we have a hard time, because so many scholars and media folks are so locked into this racism explains Republican success frame, they often... this is one of the things that drives them to make these glaring errors. In fact, myself and Matthew Iglesias recently on Twitter, the lead political editor for NBC News, put up this chart where he said, well, what's driving the growing Hispanic support for the Republican Party? Well, shifts among men. But his own chart that he and his team drew up and that he included in this tweet, his own chart showed that actually women shifted significantly more towards the Republican Party than men over the last 4 years. Hispanic women shifted significantly more to the Republican Party than men did. And so if you wanted to explain the difference, the real story of the graph is that there's not a huge gender difference. But to the extent that one gender shifted more than the other, it was actually Hispanic women who shifted more than men. But he couldn't see that. And all of the other people who produced this chart, who advised him and all of this, they were all so locked into this narrative about men supporting Trump that they couldn't see their own data. And so I pointed this out, Matthew Iglesias pointed this out, and now that tweet is community noted to highlight that his own chart shows that his narrative is clearly false. But this is a kind of problem that's not unique to him.
Musa al Gharbi is the author of We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. He teaches journalism and in the School of Communication at Stony Brook University and writes for The Guardian and many other places. And this tome's a game changer. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. It's a lot of fun.